welcome to Dialogues on India's Quest. I'm delighted to welcome as my guest a renowned physicist, feminist, ecologist, one of the most strident voices on the issues of development in the Third World. She's won several international awards, including the Right Livelihood, the Earth Award, and the Global 500 Awards. I'm delighted to welcome Vandana Shiva.
Hello, Rajiv.
Vandana, you've done a lot of work and you're interested in ecofeminism, in development issues, a whole range of issues. On this sort of 50th anniversary of India's independence, we seem to be moving away from an emphasis in development to an emphasis in globalization. We spent 50 years looking at different development strategies, and now the buzzword is globalization. How do you respond to this shift, this change?
Well, there are two ways to look at the shift. The first is that it's basically a move from globalization to development back to globalization. After all, what was British colonialism about? It was about a tiny island nation controlling 85% of the world. It was a globalization down to the detail of it being based on a free trade treaty. If people think that GATT is the first free trade treaty that the world has invented in the late 20th century, that's a mistake.
You've also said, and interestingly, that free trade is a form of protectionism. What have you meant by that?
Free trade is a form of protectionism because it changes the rules of the game and rules of societal living and weighs them in favor of the powerful, of the globally powerful. So it's not the case that it stops protecting, it just stops protecting national citizens, local communities, and starts protecting the global actors, the global multinational corporations. And that's why it's a protectionist game. It's not really a liberated game.
In what ways does it do this? What are these?
Well, it does it today as it did it in 1711 when the first free trade treaty between the East India Company and Farrukhsheer, who was the crumbling Mughal Empire, was signed. What is called a level playing field ends up being an uneven playing field with new tax concessions for foreign investors, 5-year tax holidays, massive government subsidies. We will lay the roads for you, you take out the goods. We will build the ports for you, you take out the goods. We will create new subsidies for you even while we wipe out our agricultural subsidies for our farmers and peasants. A very good example of this is the fact that, after the Punjab crisis, tomato farming was introduced into Punjab as part of globalization. The Punjab farmers were getting 75 paise for a kilogram of tomatoes. The company that was exporting those tomatoes was getting about 10 rupees per kilo of subsidies for transport, for export. So you get a privileged system of public support to the big players and a withdrawal of public support from the weak and the marginalized, and you get increasing poverty, increased marginalization, and a result of it is increasing crime. I mean, I think everywhere you look, the crime figures are increasing, and it's not an accident.
In what ways? I don't see the connection between the increase in crime, for example, and the shift.
I think our civilization has been distinctive in really having shaped itself on finding space for the smallest. It's been an organic civilization, that if you can't do anything else, get your theli and start selling. If you don't have too many assets, get a rickshaw on hire and start peddling, you make your living. Now, when the rickshawala is no more allowed to be on the roads of Delhi because they must be cleaned up for the fast Marutis, when the theliwala has to be removed because the bigger shops see them as competition, and again the fast, CLOs think it really clutters up the place, livelihood starts to get squeezed out. Slowly the space for livelihood starts to get squeezed out. Small traders start to disappear, small peasants start to disappear. And frankly, I know that if I have to bring up my son and there's no other means, what else do you do? People will rob, people will steal, girls will be sold for in prostitution. Those become the means of survival when all other dignified means have collapsed. And that's where crime continues to increase under areas of economic stress and economic insecurity as a result of this uneven playing field.
What for you is, how would you define effective, successful development, growth that we need, or is desirable?
Well, development in its original meaning, in a way, tells us what is desirable. The word comes from the field of biology. It is the potential in the seed to become a huge tree. It is the potential in that tiny embryo to become a Rajiv Mehrotra or a Vandana Shiva or whoever else. That seed going into a tree, it is developing. That's where the word development comes from. The distinctive character of that process is, A, that it's self-organized. It's written into the seed how it will grow. An acorn will only grow into an oak tree. It will not become a coconut. And so there's a self-organization. There's a structure which guides this evolution. As long as this evolution is internal, as long as it's guided from within that structure, there's balance, there's harmony, there's richness, there is wholesomeness. On the other hand, you can imagine a coconut tree being treated exactly like we've started treating cows, like milk machines, being treated as oil machines, or societies being treated as they're being wrong. You know, your agriculture is wrong, your housing is wrong, your transport is wrong, your education is wrong, and being fixed from the outside with singular purpose and with a vision that does not fit into that inner logic of evolution. And then you get these distortions. You get the misfitting, and you get what are called inefficiencies. You get the corruption. You get things not working. But it's because the wrong metaphors have got applied. A biological metaphor has got applied to a field of economics, and imposed external manipulated change has been defined as development, but it doesn't lead to development, it leads to distortion and decay.
Traditionally in India, the motivation for change or the exploration has been an internal one, and the external environment has been an expression of that internal catalyst for change. Where does sort of the impetus for this change come from to a people exposed to desiring that model of development?
Well, from two sources. One, that no matter how much you accumulate, you don't really get the satisfaction and the peace that makes life worth living. But even more importantly, that this so-called better is better only for a few people. When you start assuming in society that the main drink is Coca-Cola, and you start neglecting the sources of drinking water for ordinary people, you don't get better drinks. You get no drinks for 90% and Coke for meals for the 10%. Similarly, when you start assuming that the latest model of Ford is the only car worth having, only transport worth having, and you start wiping out the cycle and the bullock cart and the rickshaw, as cities cleaning up are doing, Calcutta, Delhi, they're all competing with each other to clean up cities of the rickshaw, even though what they need cleaning up of is the automobiles that are overpopulating and totally polluting these cities. So the ecological option is being treated as the dangerous option for humanity, and the ecologically hazardous option is being put in its place. And if we just put it together, you know, I see a lot of policy papers written. India has only 1% agro-processed foods. My God, we are so lucky. Thank God we are not eating plastic food. You know, that agro-processing is not better food. Agro-processing is better profits for a longer drawn-out chain of adding contaminants, toxics, and pollutants to what should be our source of nutrition. The best food is organic food, natural food. People who can afford to get it, buy it. And I think we've reached a time where we can start to see that better is often less.
How do we go about restructuring our society and our perceived needs?
Yeah. I think there are two convergent forces right now. It's not just that there's, you know, suddenly an enlightened elite is becoming a countervailing force to an unenlightened elite. But there is really a large part of that dispensable 80%, which is basically saying, no, we are not dispensable of society. We've been born on this earth, and we have a right to survive on this earth. The traditional fisher folk, all along 7,000 kilometers of the coastline of India, have organized for 5 years to say we won't be wiped out. We won't be wiped out by the big trawlers that come in, the foreign vessels.
But our urban aspiration is, our urban sort of perception is that their aspiration still is sort of the large car and the color television set and access to Coca-Cola and Pepsi.
I think that's where urban India is totally ignorant about how the real India lives and envisions. What has touched me in my 20 years of work, which for reasons of the fact that it's environmental work, throws me into rural areas, throws me with the fisherman's struggle, throws me in with farmers, throws me in with coastal communities. And it is just amazing that, in a way, the most evolved notion of what it is to be complete as a human being is right there in the fringes of poverty. It's not there in the heartland of affluent Delhi, but it's there in those coastal villages where people are saying, we need to fish, but we need to fish with responsibility to the sea. And we must not overfish. And we won't allow others to overfish either, and that is our struggle for justice and ecology. And in an interesting kind of way, at least in India, it's the poorest people, the tribals, the women up in Garhwal who did Chipko, the coastal people who are fighting this horrible, intensive shrimp farming that is creating, for every acre brought under production, it is destroying 200 acres of productive mangroves, farmland, and coastal ecosystems. People in those areas who literally, come back home with that much fish, have probably 2 earthen pots to cook their meals, a thatch made of palmyra. They're the ones who are saying, we have to protect nature, we have to protect other species.
Even at the cost of limiting their access to material goods?
They don't aspire for false dreams. They know that will not be theirs. They know what is available to them is a little bit of the gift of nature. And they have the ability to know the difference between need and greed. And we were so fortunate in this country that we had a man called Gandhi who in a way perceived not just the way humans do injustice to other humans by very, very clever instruments like development, like a political use of technologies. But Gandhi could see that there is enough in the world for everyone's needs, but there isn't enough in place for even some people's greed. And the problem really is some people's greed. How do you contain some people's greed? That's the issue. What globalization has done is freed up that greed, freed up that greed to be exercised without any breaks. It is, in fact, an economic system globally organized on the principles of organized greed. Yeah? And what we need to do is rebuild systems organized around need, around satisfaction, around fulfillment, and around responsibility.
Do you feel that our current predicament in some ways is because the Nehruvian vision was sort of won over the Gandhi's vision for India?
I definitely think that the fact that organized greed has been able to take over so easily and so quickly with globalization is related to the disenfranchisement that was legitimized by the Nehruvian era. What was the core content of Nehru against Gandhi's vision? The core content was a mud hut is somehow lacking. You must get incomplete houses of cement built against the ecology of the region, against the culture of the people, and you can just travel around the country where you see these Awas Vikas Yojanas, and people have tied a goat out there. They will not live in it because it never became a home. It never had the dignity. That somehow our highly evolved steel production systems that are, there in tribal areas, that they were not good enough because we need the mega projects, the giant-sized Rourkelas, and that those were the temples. I remember Nehru's statement, that dams are the temples of modern India. Now, if you look at Tehri and you talk to Sundarlal Bahuguna, you look at Narmada Valley, talk to all the activists there, they don't see these dams as their temples. They see the river as the temple. The river is the sacred. And Nehru's vision allowed the appropriation by centralized authority of the resources that belong to the people and the dismantling of a vision based on caring, compassion, and responsibility. And he legitimized violence by the state. Now the violence by the state is being replaced by violence by global corporations. But he legitimized violence.
But do you substantially and seriously believe that it would be possible for a community of people in India to resist the imperatives of globalization and the pressures that would come in from the world that would threaten our very survival?
Well, I don't think the issue is how much Indian people resist by themselves. I think we have really become globally interconnected. And I think we really are, for the first time, in an objective situation of carrying universal responsibility. That this is a transition period where people of India, linked with people of other parts of the world, having a higher sense of the fact that there is a future. It's not just 1997, it's not just 1998 and your cash registers, but the future generations and those on the margins who are, of course, pushed out from most people's thoughts, that they have to be included in whatever is designed for society. I do feel we'll go through a very bad period for a short time. After all, the World Trade Organization is in place. It's extremely rigid dispute systems mechanisms are in place. We've had rulings against India, and it's going to create tremendous turbulence and perturbation in Indian society. My own sense is because that globalization is based on the dispensability of 80% of India, sooner or later that 80% is going to say we also have a right to live. Yeah, it's not just global corporations that have a right to grow. We too have a right to live. And there will be some kind of a new dialectic put in place. So it will not be that people have to be restrained from chasing this wonderful world, but they have to be supported for wanting to maintain the little bit they have for their survival. So it's really a conflict between organized greed and survival, rather than between greed on the part of everyone and wanting to ask people, consume less. After all, 80% of India is saying, we have too little, so we don't have to consume less. Allow us to consume the little we consume. And you must start consuming less, and you must start grabbing less.
It remains an eternal sort of question as to how do we go about changing the internal motivations of people. We keep sort of looking at institutions and saying that GATT is a problem and X and Y is a problem, but ultimately it is what you and I want and what we aspire to in our private lives that manifest themselves in these larger institutions.
And I think we are more, located in a more privileged way in this quest than probably most other parts of the world, where if they have to start looking inwards, there isn't that much, except organized religion, which is equally alienating. Whereas for us, looking inwards has literally been our ongoing heritage till today. And as I keep saying, it's also the guiding force that provides survival to 80% of India's majority. I've just come back from a field program with farmers, so-called prosperous farmers of Western UP. They are spending more on inputs today, on their agriculture, than they're getting back by selling their sugarcane. Sugarcane is selling at 800 rupees a quintal, and that's what they're spending to make that sugarcane grow. They're very ready to think of a non-violent system of farming. And they're very ready to re-engage in a peaceful way with the earth. And when I ran this workshop, which was really on agriculture sustainability, conserving old seeds, you could see these old men, their eyes were lighting up, and they were talking about how we have betrayed the earth, we have betrayed our relationship. And I think that quest that from an inner rejuvenation guides an external rejuvenation, first of the earth and the environment, and then of our economies, that are economy based on high levels of equity, higher levels of satisfaction. Because the sad thing about this growth is the more it grows, the less it satisfies. Yeah, you get the next model of car, it's not good enough. It's got built-in. You're always left behind. You always have too little. You always need more. And what we need is the shifting that comes from within and right there all around us, pervading literally every thought process of people in the society. In fact, the farmers were even talking of this being in our genes. I don't think that's the case, but I do believe it's in our cultures, in our highly pluralistic and highly diversified cultures. And it's right there waiting to become the inner resurgence which is the most potent force for dealing with the material destruction of globalization. I think we've reached a point in human history where material exploitation of the kind that Marx addressed don't have to be addressed purely at the material level, that issues of material equity, economic equity, will best be addressed by a link with the deeper tapping of spiritual sources of knowing what is enough, what are the limits.
Do you see this as sort of an evolutionary process that's inevitable?
I've spent a long time becoming more and more humble about where things happen. You come out of a physics degree, and you get trained in nuclear physics, and you really have a sense of power. You have a sense of power that, it's your sense of fission energy that makes fission work. And with life, you recognize that you just go along with processes. And there's intelligence everywhere. There's intelligence, of course, where we have learned to see it in the Western educated elite of this country. But there's tremendous intelligence in that peasant woman who never learned how to read or write. And I never get too troubled about India's illiteracy because I celebrate her wisdom, which is there in such deep amounts. But I even think deeper that there's intelligence in that river, there's intelligence in the trees, there's intelligence in the grass. And the forces at work out there are so much bigger than any of us. That every time people say, but isn't it hopeless? I say, no, it's not so hopeless because there are bigger things working than the little capacities we all have. And I do believe there's an evolutionary process at work. I do believe there's a larger intelligence in coherent form at work. And that intelligence, will go through the stage of unintelligent human action. Will tolerate it and will treat it as one little hiccup in human history.
As someone who does a lot of grassroots work, what then becomes your aspiration? When you go out and reach out to people and interact with them and inform and educate and illumine as we are being here.
Well, as far as I have many relationships. One is with the grassroots, and my relationship with the grassroots is really to support and empower, never to preach and lead, but basically to get a sense they're resisting there, they need your help, they send invitations, and to really engage in their issue as if it's your own, to feel the pinch of what it is like to have your livelihood robbed from you, to not have drinking water, to have to walk 30 miles to fetch that one pot that we can get with the opening of a tap, and to literally put your whole body and soul into making their effort and their struggle realized. But I also engage with the biggest powers of the world, with the CEOs of multinationals. I was recently at the business forum that Prince Charles runs on environmental responsibility, with all the heads of these big companies of Shell and Monsanto and Pioneer. They're all sitting around. And there my dialogue is of a very different nature. It is basically in a way to tame their arrogance, to tame their certainties, and to just bring the other world I relate to, to make it living in their minds, and to say, that there's a world like this, and that world is not inferior to your world.
There has been, again, a perception that with sort of the current models of development and economic destructuring, restructuring, that in fact we have less of government, and which empowers individuals to act and to fulfill themselves. But do you believe that freedom is in fact creating new forms of tyranny? In what ways?
Well, yes, the freedom is creating new forms of tyranny, but also the state is becoming more expanded in certain domains. It's becoming less regulatory for commerce. After all, if you think of what is the beginnings of these three, the three supports of society. There's traders and commercial actors who exchange goods, engage in commercial activities. There's always structures of governance, of government, which now in modern times is called the state. And there are people, citizens, society. The role of the government and of the state has always been to regulate the trader, to not rip off the citizen. That's the only reason you need government. And that has been the role of the state in the Nehruvian era, a very centralized state, sometimes acting excessively with red tapeism, file after file after file, with babu after babu after babu behind a plate of samosa and a cup of chai, never allowing anything to move. But what's happened in a very, very quick shift is the state has got off the backs of the corporations, and the corporations can now move as they want to, invest where they want to. For many things, they don't need licenses, they don't need permission. Power plants below the capacity of 1,000 kilowatts, they don't even need to get a license. They can just go set up. So there's been a freeing up of the state for that. But if you look at another area which is very important for globalization, which is the area of intellectual property rights, you see the state in a new expanded form policing the citizen. Now, what are intellectual property rights? They are basically the idea that there can be property in the products of the mind, which didn't seem too unreasonable when it was, things like designs of cups or tables or mechanical artifacts and the mic that is recording this interview. But when you start realizing that part of what is being patented now is living materials, it's seeds, it's cell lines, it's blood cells from the umbilical cord, it's processes of embryo transfer, it is methods of planting seeds, it's seeds themselves, it's animals, it's sheep like Dolly, which was cloned and then patented. What basically is being done is that the state is now being told, this is our property, and you will police the farmer who saves the seed because he is engaging in an illegal act. You will police the student who makes a floppy because he doesn't have $300 to buy the next Windows program and makes a copy from his friend's computer. That is theft. So the normal functions of people, of members of society, to give and take in freedom, that exchange is precisely what's being criminalized, and the state's role in controlling and policing this new definition of criminality is intended to be huge. My personal sense is, and that's why I put so much energy into this issue, that it will create unlivable society, and therefore, just like slavery was resisted, I think this new form of slavery, which is making knowledge a monopoly, making life a monopoly, treating it as property, and therefore treating every normal human act as if it was theft, as if it was a crime, has to be shifted around. And there, of course, we'll have a very interesting, and we are seeing it right now in India, very interesting dialogue between what are the roles of the state, what are the roles of commercial interests, and what are the roles of citizens, and what are the rights and responsibilities of each of these actors.
But this has happened or has been supported by the community largely because the state has been perceived to be inefficient in regulating commerce and is now seen as being inefficient in delivering social services, whether it is health or education and the needs of the citizens, public transportation and what have you. What do you see as the relationship or the function then of the state?
Well, I think that's where the Nehruvian era comes into play. What did the Nehruvian era do? It took over the functions of the community and put it in the hands of the state. And now we are being told the state is inefficient. But the option to the state is not globalized profit-making institutions to deliver health and education and social services. It is an empowered community. And therefore, if we ensure that resources move back to the communities and the kind of appropriation of resources which are leaving our villages increasingly poor, our cities are rotting. I come from Dehradun, which was one of the most beautiful cities in this country during my childhood. Why was it beautiful? Because every mohalla was allowed to collect its own money to run the cleaning operations. Every house could supervise whether their drains were cleaned. 1970s, our entire municipal structures were dismantled. Local governments weren't allowed to be elected. We had a whole dismantling of local democracy in this country. We had everything residing in Delhi. And then when the DMs used to know, oh, the Prime Minister's coming, suddenly you get a cleanup operation. The rest of the time, things rot and stink. The solution really is put more back into the hands of the communities. And that more is both decision-making as well as resources.
Do you see the efforts of the government on Panchayati Raj and sort of some devolution of power as being a beginning in this?
I think that has tremendous potential. And what the tribals have done with the extension of the Panchayati Raj Act to the scheduled areas, which is the tribal areas, in December of '96, is an absolutely path-breaking legislation which wasn't even reported by the newspapers, but it basically says the community will be the highest competent authority to decide how it will govern itself. It will be the highest competent authority to decide its development plans. It will be the highest competent authority to work out the use of its natural resources. Now, once you start getting that, what happens is the circle, in a way, gets complete. A lot of destruction environmentally takes place because those who benefit from resource exploitation are not the ones who have to suffer the costs of that exploitation. The costs are left for someone else to bear. The moment you put together in the same group the exploitation, utilization, and the bearing of costs, you start getting utilization that will not generate unnecessary costs, because people will not generate unnecessary costs for themselves. And you start getting a balance of rights with responsibilities. You get a new situation of community responsibility emerging. And I think there's the potential, though unfortunately many places what's being done is the Panchayati Raj Act is being treated as just a full sort of instruction downstream of highly centralized and uniform instructions. So it's really becoming like an instruction ladder rather than an empowerment base.
You know, you describe yourself and are described by others as an eco-feminist. What or who is an eco-feminist? What does it mean?
Well, it means literally someone who's ecological and feminist at the same time and doesn't find the two things running into conflict with each other.
But in what ways does sort of being ecologically wise and sane, how does that sort of reflect in being rationally, logically, holistically feminist? What is the relationship? What is the interface between the two?
Well, I believe the relationship basically is that it creates a deeper ecologist and it creates a deeper feminist. When you get a sense that both the destruction of nature and the oppression of women are connected in a certain kind of worldview, a worldview that has treated creativity and creation as an act that destroys. You know, when you cut the tree, you're creating. When you protect the tree, you're not creating. When you create a huge dam, you have controlled water. If you've made a small water harvesting system, you haven't. That is precisely the kind of boundary, I call it the creation boundary, that has excluded nature's contributions and therefore allowed us to destroy nature, and has excluded women's contribution and has allowed women to be treated as the second sex. That common root of the subjugation of women and the domination of nature in this worldview of value being in the market, of creation being in the hands of men who control the market and capital, allows you then to recognize that to shift ecologically, you really need changes in human relationships, power relationships between different classes, different genders, different castes. And as a feminist, you start to recognize that it's not enough to run a race as fast as the men, because they were running the wrong race. You start running a different kind of race. And you don't even run a race anymore. You start working in partnership with nature, and you start defining improvement and evolution on totally different parameters. So it creates a different kind of feminism. It creates a more peaceful feminism, but also a more subversive feminism that challenges at a more fundamental level.
You know, when you go out in your role as an eco-feminist into rural communities, and what you say to the women there in terms of their aspirations, their rights, in terms of their relationships. At one level, we look at these rural communities and look at their eco-friendliness, look at their relationship to the environment. But at the same time, we perceive, sitting here in our urban habitats, that is where a great deal of the exploitation of the woman also takes place.
Well, you know, I think very often in culturally diverse situations, there has been a confusion between seeing division of labor as necessarily an hierarchical affair, which need not be the case. You can have highly, rigid divisions of labor in tribal societies. You can have highly rigid divisions of labor in some other societies, but they are not in an hierarchical relationship with each other. One is not superior to the other. And what happens from urban situations or from a Western location is, because we are used to hierarchies, We project those hierarchies into situations where people are not experiencing that particular relationship as an hierarchy. Then we start saying, oh, the women and the men don't sit together. Frankly, in today's world, I'd rather have the women and men sitting separate, because you'll be molested, you'll be pinched, you'll be, there's no problem. What's the problem in our society when marriages take place? The women sit in one part of the room and the men sit in another. Now, a lot of my Western feminist friends, the biggest thing they enter a room and the most troublesome aspect for them is, why aren't they mixing? I say, well, what's so desperate about mixing around? You don't lose out if you're not mixing. There's nothing perverted about you. And as far as violence against women is concerned, I think we are starting to get a sense that it is intimately related to the kind of growth of permissiveness and freedom from accountability. Man would try and beat a wife in a village. Everyone around will come and say, mat karo, we'll hold him back. Because everyone can mind your business. Now we live in these huge apartment buildings, and the wife is battered, and there's no one. She's an atom. And in an atomized society, the violence against women is in fact much more vigorous. I think we are, of course, at a stage where the debates within feminism are getting very, very intense. And the debates, I believe, will replay the debates in ecology and the debates in development. And the debates will be around this issue of, is the world fragmented, atomistic, separated, or is the world interconnected? And if it's interconnected, then what are the connections that we must nurture by the way we live? And each of us is in a position to generate a set of relationships that makes the larger web more desirable for everyone.
At the sort of mundane level, a perception might be that with the level of material progress that we have achieved globally and in different communities, that the best we can hope for is perhaps to freeze the greed of people who now aspire to their better cars and their larger television sets and what have you, and hope that the rest of the community will catch up. That seems sort of the aspiration of people that feel that this is maybe attainable, and we can't seriously expect, or can we, that these affluent sections of the community will give up. For example, if the United States consumes X units of energy per capita, which threatens the environment, do we really see the possibility that communities such as those will cut back, or are we going to look at technological solutions that will suggest more efficient uses of energy?
Well, I think both processes are underway, but in fact much faster than the technology revolution. And the way it's being called in the environmental community is into 4, factor 4 is what it's called, that we have the capacity technologically to reduce our resource consumption by half and improve the level of output by 2, so that you really get a factor 4 increase in availability of services and goods. And that's technologically possible. That's one thing. But there is the most tremendous movement that has taken place in the United States, in that heart of consumerist culture, which is the simplicity movement. And there's a tiny little book that has triggered it. It's called Your Money or Your Life. And it's written by a couple that basically said, you are feeling imprisoned by this race of consumerism. You want a life that brings you satisfaction. These are the ways in a highly controlled American society, not controlled by the state, but deeply controlled by the marketplace, where you can't move around and choose to live differently. There's a simplicity revolution that has millions and millions of participants who are cutting down their incomes, going into part-time jobs, and cutting down their expenses. So while you have a factor 4 revolution in technology, I would think you have a factor 8 revolution in simplicity. And that simplicity revolution is really taking place at the heart of consumerism. I mean, look at Delhi. Look at our crazy elite Delhiites who are running for Vipassana meditation, who are running for Reiki, who are running for this and that. After all, they're running because they're looking for something else for satisfaction. Now, my sense is that it is not the case that the only road to walk is the materialistic road, and in that you need to technologically change things. But I think there are other roads that are less walked by in other societies, but have been more walked by us in our society. And those are to really start asking that fundamental question, what is development about? Is it development of how you feel, how you live, what you contemplate, and having the minimum needs of living a life with adequate food, adequate shelter, adequate water? Or is development more and more goods being traded, everyone deeply insecure, no one knowing what job they'll be doing tomorrow, and everyone frantic and panicky and not able to have a simple, stable relationship with the earth, with another human being, with a cat, a dog, or whatever?
Tell me about yourself. That you started off, your formal education was as a physicist, which was, as you mentioned, is empirical. It, in some senses, sort of breeds a sense of power, of controlling nature, the elements of nature. Well, was there a cataclysmic moment, an experience, or something that in a sense made you reach out to the more subtle, the more intuitive?
Well, life is full of many cataclysmic moments, not just one. In fact, it's the only way you live. That there are just so many dramatic events that really make you redefine the very ground on which you stand. But there are some very, very particular moments that, of course, have been more significant.
What was it for you?
Well, there was a moment in which, when I was within experimental nuclear physics, working as a trainee in the fast breeder reactor in Bhabha Atomic Research Center, my sister Meera was very, very panicky. You are working in a reactor and you don't know what it could do to you. Now, as a physicist, I was never taught about the hazards that nuclear radiation can cause. So when I came home, I started talking to her, and I just felt very outraged that here I felt I knew everything about nuclear systems. But we are only taught about how to generate the energy. We aren't taught about the interaction of nuclear radiation with living systems, including our bodies. And that was my first step in recognizing the incompleteness of science and incompleteness of scientific training. Pushed me into theoretical research. And eventually I did a PhD in Foundations of Quantum Theory, which is a training in accepting uncertainty. And of course, since then, I have never, ever been attached to certainty. I've never been attached to the kind of sacreds of classical Newtonian mechanics. In a way, quantum theory opens up the world in such unpredictable ways that nothing is too troublesome. Then, of course, during that same period, I got very close to the Chipko movement, and my voluntary work with the Chipko movement changed a lot of my thinking. It changed my thinking in terms of who knows. I had to change my mind. I was the daughter of a forest conservator, and I used to mix around with forest officers all the time, and I knew those women in those villages know far more about how many species are what and what they're useful for than our trainees from the Forest Research Institute, who know 10 timber species. But they don't know that little medicinal plant that is a magical healer when you get a wound cut. So my whole definition of who knows started to change, but also my definition. After all, I'm a child of Western feminism. I'm a child of urban feminism. And suddenly, I started to realize there's a whole different power at play when 1,000 women of a village get together and tell a contractor, we won't let you enter. They're self-organizing. They're self-organizing for a different purpose. And the urban women's movement had only engaged in women's issues being related to women's bodies. And here were the Chipko women saying women's issues are about how the forests are managed. They're about how rivers are used. They're about how we use the earth. Women, every issue is a woman's issue. And that just broadened my thinking in terms of feminist issues very, very radically, and basically shaped me into what they now label me as an eco-feminist.
But wouldn't you say that the sort of the shift and transformation that we seek and aspire to is as much a matter of spirituality and perhaps religion, if I could use that word in its most liberal sense, as a technique for internal transformation that then begins to impact and influence larger external decisions and processes?
I think, religion has been so appropriated for political purpose that most people, like I shrink when they hear the word religion now, because for them it just signifies fundamentalism, communal wars, etc. Um, I think the most serious sacrifice that was made by the Western scientific and industrial revolution and by the Nehruvian era in India was the sacrifice of our spirituality. Because the Industrial Revolution basically created a desacralized world and made people believe that if you actually saw intelligence in the tree or treated a tree as sacred, there was something wrong with you. You were a deficient culture. That if you believed that working out the objectives of your life, what we have in our society called purusharth, is something that comes from within you, that again is being underdeveloped, that being backward, that's being primitive, and being developed is the prescription that you receive with a World Bank loan. These were the kinds of erosions of our spiritual springs that we have suffered over the last 50 years, but these springs are too deep and they haven't dried up. And I think all we need to do is, in a way, turn back to tap them again, learn how to tap them again. It's a major learning exercise.
You know, the empiricism of Western science, as you pointed out, has pointed to the principle of uncertainty and other areas where people now talk about the meeting ground between science and spirituality and what have you. Do you engage in any of the formal processes of the more intuitive insights that you might reach out to?
I think so, because for example, I'll tell you, one of the most significant debates taking place right now, is what is a biological organism? Is it just genes? Are these genes like atoms? Is it the self-organization and interdependence of cells and proteins and RNA and DNA? I'm not a biologist, I had no training in biology. But intuitively, I just got a sense that these are very fundamental questions. And about 5 years ago, I organized a meeting called Redefining the Life Sciences, Beyond Reductionism in Biology. And it brought together some of the best minds of biology. Now, each of those people leaped, had their own quantum leap, because, they'd worked out something different, something new. But together, instantaneously, we had a world sort of chain reaction of different intuitive thinking about how to relate to other forms of life, how to think of species, how to think of organisms. And that process of shift is so dramatic. And this handful of scientists, I think, about 20 at the meeting, about 5 have stayed very, very vigorous, are today the alternative, which is engaged in Monsanto defining biology, Cargill defining biology, Sandoz defining biology. And it's a very, very creative engagement. So I do think intuition has a very, very huge role, because it's intuition that the word that someone gave to me the other day about this wholesome knowing is sakendrit. Yeah? That all your indriyas are at work to know together. In reductionist knowledge, when you chop up, your knowing is extremely fragmented, because first you're told all that exists in the world is things like tables and chairs. And even in the tables and chairs, the only qualities they have are dimensions and weight. So you get vernier calipers and you get weighing machines, and that's all the world is. The world is subtle. The world is layer and layer and layer. And I think we're very fortunate that even in the sciences, this subtle level is becoming the more known level, whether it's quantum theory or whether it's the new biologies, where interrelationships are becoming the points that's studied. And how can you study interrelationships? You can't study it through vivisection. You can't study living relationships after you've killed your cockroach or your frog, because then it's dead. The new technologies being evolved related to the radiations and energy patterns of organisms, of how to do nonviolent studies, of how different parts of a self-organized system are related to each other. And there are tremendous breakthroughs. We're sitting literally in a watershed where we could literally go down and into this morass of some people over-consuming and others not having anything at all. Or we could, enter the world with a whole new liberated mind, a mind liberated through this more subtle knowing, and which suddenly, having more is not the end of life, but being more at peace with everything around you is really the end of life.
You know, the access to this intuitive knowing is possible both through the empirical, logical, rational processes and the traditional techniques of insight that we have cultivated in India, of the different yogas, of meditation. Have you found have you experimented with this in your own life? Or has yours been the root of Western empiricism, arriving at these same insights?
But I might not have sort of been a very disciplined yoga student or a very, very disciplined meditator. I'm an indisciplined meditator. I'm an indisciplined yoga student. But I think the moments of real insight, even for someone like me, are not really moments of logical analysis. They're really moments of having the equivalent of the meditative experience.
That's what I meant. That is the experiential insight that you arrive at from both these parts. Are there sort of similarities in it, or are they sort of just intellectually seem similar?
No, I think they are not just similarities. They have to be of the same quality. And the quality is really this. Science, as it has been taught, reductionist science, is basically based on taking things apart. But the real insights come when you can put them together. Yeah? Now this putting together and seeing in the whole, seeing in the full set of relationships, that's the real achievement of a meditative experience, an intuitive experience, and an insight. Because working through the rules of any calculus, any scientific discipline, once a student has been taught that, anyone will go through it. That's not what makes the difference between the insightful mind and the not insightful mind. After all, we put out millions of students, but they just keep repeating in a mundane way what a computer could repeat, and computers are doing it more quickly than us, or what anyone in any society trained in that will repeat. The insight really comes from dedication. Dedication, whether it's for the scientist or it's for the one who's walking the more spiritual path, comes from literally putting all your being, every cell of your being, every part of your consciousness in total concert, in total focus, into just one concentration. And that is what then allows the leaps to happen. It allows the other things to flow. But you don't look for the insight. You can't look for the insight. What you look for is a dedication. What you engage in is a giving of yourself in fullness. And then a result of it sometimes is you arrive at seeing. And that's why, in India, we've always called philosophy darshan, which is to see, not to analyze. We've never equated philosophy with logic as they have in the West. We've equated it with the seeing in the whole. That seeing can only come when you're sort of there together in one. And I don't think you can you can't jump the steps in this. You can't say, now I'm going to have the holistic image of what this ecosystem is about, or what human relationships of peaceful conduct are about. You just feel that you have to give yourself to a certain purpose. Once you offer yourself, and that's why I feel that we've always talked about sacrifice and yajna. Sacrifice not in the sense of chop up the head, which it was brutalized into being with animal sacrifices, but sacrifice in the sense of become one with the other through a dedication. And in that becoming one with the other, you get a knowledge of the other in ways that is quite impossible through fragmented methods.
Vandana Shiva, thank you very much indeed. It's been a great pleasure.